So I wanted to start tonight by telling you a story from the first chapter of my book. And this is the story of Junius Henry Braun. Braun was a very successful journalist living in Manhattan in the 1860s. He wasn't so successful, though, that he could live the way he wanted to, which was in a private brownstone. Like most middle-class New Yorkers at the time, he lived in a hotel. Then he got married, and he had kids. And like many men in particular at the time, he didn't think that living in such a public, this is a term he used, form of accommodation like a hotel, was good for wives and children. Next slide. The sensible thing to do, he wrote, would have been to leave for the suburbs, or at least for Brooklyn. But Braun couldn't do it. Quote, "I'd rather be crowded into rear fourth-story rooms here," he wrote, "than own a handsome home beyond the smell of the sea, or in the rear of Brooklyn, along the lines of the New Jersey railroads, among the sand knolls of Long Island, or amid the pastures of Westchester," end quote. Next slide. Unfortunately, even fourth-story rooms, let alone a well-designed apartment in one of the city's new French flats, was beyond his means. Rents in the Stuyvesant, which we see here, which we generally agree was the city's first kind of purpose-built, a middle-class apartment building, were about $1,200 to $1,500 a year. That was about half the average income of an upper-middle-class family at the time, the equivalent roughly of about $11,000 to $14,000 per month today. And at other new buildings, rent was even higher. Meanwhile, even in the best of the new French flat buildings, there were always complaints. You can read the real estate record of the New York Times, and they're full of moans and groans about poor service, small rooms, awkward layouts, rent increases, frequent turnover, noisy and unpleasant neighbors. Next slide. The solution for Braun was what I call co-ownership, or in a nod to the most common type of co-ownership today, condo living. It came from an unexpected source, a French architect named Philip Hubert, and he preferred the anglicized pronunciation, Hubert. Hubert had grown up something of a reformer. His father was also an architect and had designed at least one felon stair for Charles Fourier, such as that depicted here. And in the late 1870s, living in New York, he started thinking about adapting Fourier's concept of a collectively owned community to solve one of the modern city's most vexing problems: decent, affordable housing in a place that even then was astronomically expensive. Next slide. Hubert called his plan the Home Club. Real estate reporters labeled it cooperative or co-op. The idea was that by pooling resources to develop and manage a building, families could carve out permanent homes for themselves in the city, designed how they liked, with neighbors they liked, with a landlord they liked themselves. The first result, which we see here, just to the left of Carnegie Hall, which was built later, was called the Rembrandt. It opened in 1881 on West 57th Street. And Braun reared his 3 children there and lived there until he died. And I think, you know, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Here on 57th Street, we're just, you know, within feet of several of the most expensive and most talked about ultra luxury, ultra slender condominium buildings going up today. Now, the benefits of co-ownership were several. It wasn't cheap, but gone were rent increases. More importantly, trick or treat, gone was some of the uncertainty that characterized modern city life. Ownership couldn't change a neighborhood from turning unfashionable after a few years, but it could minimize anonymous neighbors, social mixing, transients. And of equal importance, I argue, it offered many of the privileges of owning a house. You could redecorate or remodel. You could also invest in city real estate. What's more, it offered these things not just to people who couldn't afford their own house, like Braun. It offered these to other kinds of people, people who didn't want or need whole houses, people like widows and single women. And in fact, in the Rembrandt, half the owners were widows or single women, and that's a ratio that's characteristic of many co-owned buildings in the U.S. ever since. For these reasons and more, Hubert's home clubs democratized urban homeownership. And more than that, I want to suggest that it made multifamily housing American in ways it could never have been in hotels or rental buildings. Next slide. Now, in the years that followed the Rembrandt, co-ownership spread quickly. There was a kind of a home club craze in the 1880s, and despite skepticism after the failure of the Central Park Apartments, which is the largest and most lavish of that craze, we see the trend continue on into the new century. Next slide. By 1910, the co-op, as people were then calling it in the abbreviated name, had become a preferred way for affluent families to live in the city. And as real estate prices rose, the rich began to buy apartments too, leading to a wave of ultra-luxury buildings on the east side in the 1920s, especially Fifth Avenue and Park Avenue. Next slide. Apart from the usual benefits of ownership, an additional appeal, at least to this crowd, was that co-ownership could be used as a tool for social exclusion. This, of course, was an era of great social mobility, but also one of xenophobia, of anti-Semitism. In high-class suburbs in this era, we start to see the racial deed restriction become ubiquitous. And in cities, we see middle-class and well-to-do families using the sort of mechanisms, the screening mechanisms available in co-ops, which had become customary in co-ops, to do the same, to screen initial sales, where developers would screen initial sales, and then boards would screen resales. And of course, the ostensible concern then, as now, was financial. While every buyer had enough money to complete the sale, there were concerns that one wanted evidence that people would be able to withstand temporary hardship, that they had sufficient character to keep up with their obligations. Because of course, again, then as now, when you buy an apartment, you're not just buying a home, you're also buying a share of a large building, and you're signing on for a range of common responsibilities for keeping that building up. Next slide. Now, while the history of co-ownership might simply follow this, or might simply have followed this trajectory of high-class living, and certainly I could fill this talk with a progression of superlatives in design, height, and price without ever leaving Manhattan. One of the most fascinating things about co-ownership I found in researching the book is that its history was not linear. Next slide. To the contrary, the history of co-ownership is extremely varied. It's varied physically, geographically, and socially. The idea for co-ownership cropped up anew time and again in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in different places, among different sort of kinds of clients, and in different metropolitan environments. Middle-class families in Washington, civil servants got together in Washington, D.C. to develop the very first co-owned apartment there, which we see at the left in the early 1890s. In Chicago, it was a group of ultra-rich families who got together, completed the first building at the turn of the 20th century. In the Bay Area, 1912 saw what they called the first group home. In LA, we saw an entirely kind of novel, in fact, system for effecting co-ownership called the Own Your Own, appearing beginning in 1921. Next slide. Working class families also turned to co-ownership. New York, again, was the leading center. Here we see Alcu 1 and 2. These are the first co-owned buildings developed by and for working class families in the U.S. in the Finntown section of Sunset Park in Brooklyn. Like middle-class families, these new immigrants were moved chiefly by the desire to lower the cost of housing and to secure permanent homes for themselves in the city. Now, unlike the middle class, unlike Junius Henry Braun and Philip Hubert, the Finns had a lot of experience with co-ownership in the form of cooperative corporations, that is, non-profit consumers and producers cooperatives. Middle-class families were looking primarily at the business corporation and the country club as a model for co-ownership, whereas these guys had this other long tradition. Now, the phrasing is a bit unfortunate. Cooperative was used in any number of ways in the 19th century. It was used to refer to savings and loan societies, for mutual self-help groups. If anyone's familiar with Dolores Hayden's writing, it was used for any kind of hotel or apartment building with collective services, collective kitchens. And of course, it was also used for co-ownership, as I'm using it here. But it also referred specifically to the international movement of non-profit collective production and consumption, which emerged in northern England in the early 19th century in response to degraded industrial conditions, where workers were getting together and figuring out how to control the means of production and also distribution of goods and services through non-profit cooperative enterprise. When the Finns came to New York, they brought with them, it spread throughout Britain and Scandinavia, and when the Finns arrived in New York, they were opening up cooperative groceries and bakeries, parking garages, and sort of a next logical step in the mid-1910s was to think about housing, and they went ahead and developed the first sort of cooperative, if you will, to use the same term in two different ways in the same phrase. And here we see these first two here. Now, in the more sort of general lexicon, this model came to be called limited equity or nonprofit, because one of the distinguishing features, what sort of made a cooperative, as opposed to market rate, was that there were restrictions on resale, and later we see restrictions also on income and on profits. Next slide, please. Now, other New Yorkers emulated what they saw the Finns doing. First among them were several groups of kind of bohemian types, writers, artists, settlement house workers, others with middle-class expectations and tastes in housing, but working-class incomes. And they planned several projects on Beekman Hill, on the Upper East Side, Brooklyn Heights, and the Village. Here we see the Bedford Barrow Cooperative, which was 8 tenements that were refurbished by Clarence Stein to create a non-profit co-op. Next slide, please. Next up were projects initiated by housing reformers who hoped not only to offer workers better living conditions, but who believed that home ownership could forestall or even reverse slum conditions by instilling in tenants a pride of ownership. Here we see one of the small co-ops that Clarence Stein developed at Sunnyside Garden, where Susan lives, Colonial Court, and this is just an example of this kind of genre of philanthropic limited equity co-op. Next slide, please. Following these efforts came the efforts of the Jewish left, particularly through unions, but other fraternal groups, whose upwardly mobile members were tired of living in Lower East Side tenements, tired of tenancy and the landlord, but were not ready to go out and buy houses in the suburbs. And their solution was to go up to the Bronx and to build projects like the amalgamated cooperative apartments, which we see here. Next slide. Equally prolific was the staunch conservative John D. Rockefeller Jr., who built a series of large co-ops in and around the city in the 20s, including the Thomas Apartments in the Bronx, which we see here. Next slide. And also the Dunbar Apartments for African American families in Harlem, which became a hugely important center of black life in New York for decades and has been in the news ever since due to a lot of struggles with a recent landlord, which you maybe have followed. And one of the interesting things about co-ownership, which Rockefeller's involvement in particular shows us, is that co-ownership appealed both to the left and the right. To the left, it was an alternative to capitalism, and to the right, it was a bulwark against socialism. Rockefeller was very explicit in his opposition to any sort of public interventions in the housing market, and he believed that co-ownership offered a kind of a best way to sort of prevent that from going forward. Next slide, please. Now, in the 1930s, the progressive possibilities of co-ownership came into new focus in precisely this push for public housing. And many housers at the time argued not just for state-owned rental housing for the poor, but for aid to nonprofit co-ops, both for working families and also for the middle class. And despite some support on the right for this, mainstream real estate interests were suspicious, and in the end it enjoyed little support in Congress, and these provisions for co-ops were excluded from the public housing program. They were, however, included in the legislation which set up the Federal Housing Administration, or FHA, in 1934. Next slide. And when we think of the post-war American city, or the mid-20th century American city, we tend to think of two extremes. We think of white flight, ticky-tacky suburbs financed by FHA on the one hand. On the other, we think of distressed inner cities, increasingly black and Latino and stocked with high-rise rentals. But in large part because of FHA, there was also a third strand of housing, and this was co-owned housing, mainly in the form of co-ops. Next slide, please. Immediately after the war, amid the tremendous housing shortage, many embraced co-ownership as a way to take matters into their own hands. Rather than wait for developers to get around to build the housing they wanted, families banded together to develop projects themselves. In New York, where the crisis was most acute, several groups of veterans got together to produce projects like Bell Park Gardens, which we see on the right. This is in Bayside, Queens. Next slide. New York City and state also lent support to unions and other nonprofits who developed tens of thousands of limited equity co-ops in the post-war decades, many in urban redevelopment areas like Queensview, which we see on the left, and Astoria, and Penn South, which was a Title I urban renewal project in Manhattan on the right. Next slide. Robert Moses, as you can imagine, had little interest in supporting the progressive policies of unions in their push for limited equity housing, but he understood that groups like the International Ladies Garment Workers Union or the Amalgamated Clothing Workers knew how to get things done. This was, of course, his mantra, and he vigorously supported projects like Chatham Green in Manhattan and Co-op City in the Bronx. Next slide. Outside of New York, where politics were less progressive, the housing crisis less intense, and apartment living was less ingrained as a tradition, we see very little of this activity in housing. But co-ownership took on other new forms. One example that I discuss in a chapter of the book is the row-type garden apartment complex, or what most Americans outside of New York today call townhouses. The single-family house predominated nearly everywhere in the 50s, but readily developed farmland was disappearing, and prices for land were going up. More importantly, by the 60s, the American family was beginning to change. In real estate circles, everyone knew the baby boom was about to grow up and go to college and leave home, and would constitute an important new housing market. But beyond that, people were starting to marry later. They were having fewer children. Women began working outside the home. More people were living alone. And the townhouse outside of very dense city centers catered to these kinds of burgeoning new social groups. Next slide, please. The townhouses' origins were twofold. Early suburban developments with a reform agenda like Sunnyside had used row houses in novel ways. Meanwhile, in the 30s, FHA had begun shifting most apartment construction from elevator buildings in dense centers to these kind of green campus-like walk-up structures, often with just 2 stories, like Garden Bay Manor in Queens, we see on the left, and Colonial Village outside of Washington on the right. Next slide. As pressure mounted for alternatives to suburbia in the post-war Sunbelt, developers such as Eichler Homes in the Bay Area, 2 of whose projects we see here, married these traditions and created complexes in which every unit was on 2 stories rather than stacked as flats above and below each other, sort of mimicking the conditions of an urban row house. Next slide. Not only did this eliminate noise from above and below, which of course was a major complaint in apartment living, it better approximated the conditions of the detached house, and it allowed private patios, even private parking in the form of garages or driveways in some complexes. And typically these complexes were also serviced by a clubhouse, maybe a swimming pool. And this form of ownership, or sort of physical form, as well as form of ownership, became ubiquitous throughout the Sun Belt over the course of the 60s and 70s. Here we see an example in the large photograph from Newport News, Virginia, and a more recent example from Atlanta on the left. Next slide. A second example of how Americans used co-ownership outside of New York after World War II in new creative ways was as retirement housing. Historically, most older Americans didn't live in homes of their own. They lived with extended families, in rooming houses, in small hotels, or other unmentionable institutions and sanatoria and homes for the aged. Certainly some spent part of the year in winter resort areas, but mostly at hotels. We can think of Morris Lapidus's Grand Miami Beach hotels, which proliferated in the 50s. But alongside those hotels in the 50s, union pensions, Social Security, inexpensive air travel, greater longevity, all formed a kind of perfect storm to make mass retirement possible in this country. Demand for permanent retirement housing surged. This housing was unique in that it had sort of 3 specific sort of requirements. One was that, like resort hotels, it had to offer people things to do. This was, of course, for people who are retired. The neighborhood didn't have to be structured around work or child rearing, but around leisure. A second related requirement was that housing had to facilitate social interaction. If you were going to move to Miami or to wherever, you might know people, but you needed to be able to make friends. And the third requirement was ownership. Much of the market for retirement housing were people who had substantial assets in houses that they had owned up north. Maybe they had paid a mortgage for 30 years. And they wanted to trade in those houses to put cash into full ownership of a retirement home so that they could keep their month-to-month expenses very low because they were living on fixed small pensions. Next. In the 50s, developers experimented with retirement versions of post-war suburbia, large tracts of small, single-family houses. And by the late 50s, we see more highly programmed sort of country club type communities, such as Sun City, being built on the exurban fringes of places like Phoenix. But like dual income families or single women, many seniors didn't care to look after a lawn or a roof, and many also didn't want to live at the suburban fringe. Next slide. The solution for them was co-owned apartments. And by the 50s, we see a massive wave of co-op construction in places like coastal Florida or in coastal Southern California. Next slide, please. The most extraordinary of these was a community in Orange County, California called Leisure World, built in 1962, which had about 7,000 FHA-insured co-op apartments, making it the single largest co-owned apartment complex in the world at the time it was built, far surpassing anything that Abe Kazan and the United Housing Foundation or Robert Moses were thinking about doing in New York. Co-op City, of course, would be larger, but it was still hadn't been even sort of conceived of yet at this point. Leisure World announced, and this is the developer Ross Cortese surveying his complex, which of course, you know, critics compared this to rabbit hutches, but in the book, resales and confusion surrounding the differences between a proprietary lease and a conventional rental lease made most bankers extremely skittish about lending money. They didn't see an owned apartment as good collateral for a mortgage loan. Yeah?
Because I was confused about the FHA funded projects, and so the funding went to the board, so it wasn't as if an individual resident could seek to be funded to live in a co-op.
Yes, it was more like FHA rental programs where you're dealing with a body corporate that had to conform to specific kind of limited equity or nonprofit restrictions in order to qualify for construction loans, and you know, FHA was just sort of ensuring the whole of the complex. So that was the financial problem. Impossible to get mortgages, and you basically had to do whatever the entire building was doing. There was no flexibility. The social problem concerned exclusion. If on Park Avenue, exclusion might have been considered an asset among many retirees or potential retirees in the late 50s and 60s, many of whom in a lot of this market was Jewish families from New York. Social exclusivity was seen as a limitation. The open housing movement had to end racial segregation had picked up steam by the 1960s, and despite the long tradition of union co-ops, which had always been integrated, the format kind of smacked of exclusivity and seemed sort of fussy to a lot of people. So there was this sort of kind of emotional or image problem with this format. To address these concerns, the kind of social and emotional on the one hand and the question of financing on the other, Florida bankers promoted an alternative plan of ownership, the individual title system. Under this plan, common elements were still owned by a single body, in this case the association, but the property's deed and title were subdivided to allow each unit a unique one. There was no tradition of screening for sales or resales in this format, although associations were given the power or the right of first refusal. This individual title system had first been pioneered in medieval Europe and 12th century Germany, and had since spread throughout the continent and to Latin America through the Napoleonic Civil Code. And in the 30s and 40s, as we see a kind of boom in multifamily housing in Europe and in Latin America, it's this system which is being used for the most part to affect ownership. Now, one of the interesting things is that in Europe, at least, where the tradition of apartment living was long and deep, no one used any specific terminology to refer to this form of living. People talked about owning apartments. Within the law, there were some specific terms which emerged. In France, the term co-property was used. In Spain and several other countries, horizontal property, meaning you would own a horizontal slice of land. In Italy, the term was condominio, which was a Latin neologism referring to joint dominion. And this last term became popularized in Latin America as this form of living came into play really in the 40s and 50s as a way to distinguish owned apartments, so higher class apartment living, from ordinary rented accommodations, much in the way in the US we had used co-op to distinguish owned apartments from ordinary buildings, and it sort of lent an air of distinction. Next, please. By 1957, this new system and its odd name had spread to Florida's backyard, Cuba, and more importantly, Puerto Rico, where Florida mortgage lenders did a lot of business. And when they saw San Juan's first condominio going up, the Condominio San Luis, which we see here, which was built next to the Caribe Hilton, they became convinced that this was a model which would do well in Florida. Now, some housing experts were skeptical. They saw the legal differences between these plans really as sort of superficial, and moreover, they worried that the new customs that came with condos, unrestricted resales, and individual deeds, sent a risky message to buyers that condos were free of collective obligations. Next. But just as, sorry?
Excuse me, when was that?
This is late 50s, early 60s.
Sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's fine. And I can talk more. I'll continue on, but 1961, 62 is when we see the first experiments with this format in the U.S. And just as the mortgage bankers anticipated, the public totally bought the idea that condo was A, something different than co-op, and B, something more desirable. And really everywhere except for Manhattan, where in the late 60s and 70s there was a real estate downturn, at least in residential construction, we see the condo superseding the co-op almost overnight. In Florida, you'll see developers literally putting up identical twin buildings, one co-op, one condo, and the condo sells out and the co-op goes begging. So that was it for the co-op. And in California, I mentioned there was a third system, the own your own, and that also quickly falls out of favor. In Florida alone, hundreds and thousands of condominiums were built in the 60s and 70s, including these which we see here in North Miami Beach, sort of quickly transforming the place into really a new kind of hybrid city, high-rise, yet also sort of suburban, with these Corbusian green spaces, although rather than parks, they're golf courses. And you know, one writer characterized this in Florida as the condominium coast, and I think that's a great term. Next. Now, while complex post-war social changes produced new physical forms like the townhouse and new legal forms like the condominium, co-ownership also continued to evolve as middle-class housing in big city centers after World War II, adapting to meet new social, economic, and political conditions. One of the most fascinating uses of co-ownership in this regard was as a private response to the post-war urban crisis. This is a very recent New Yorker cartoon, but it speaks to these issues very well. I don't know if everyone can read, but could our co-op secede from the United States and govern itself? In the immediate post-war years, as veterans and unions pursued limited equity co-ops on slum clearance sites or in the outer boroughs, interest in co-ownership, at least in white-collar Manhattan, actually fell. And the reason for this was rent control. During the Depression, or rather during World War II, rent control had been introduced as a federal program, and rents were frozen at sort of near Depression-era lows. So even if you were very rich and anti-Semitic, there was very little reason to want to own your apartment in 1947 because your rent was so good. There were also worries about ownership, the safety of ownership. During the Depression, many co-ops had failed financially and ended up as bank-owned rentals. One writer described the Park Avenue co-op as like owning the hole in a donut. Another evocative turn of phrase that expressed anxieties surrounding multifamily homeownership in this era. Next slide, please. Over time, though, rent control took its toll on buildings, and to make them pay, landlords began cutting back on maintenance and services. Doormen were fired, lobby decorations disappeared, crime mounted in the city. There were muggings in apartment elevators where recently there had been an elevator operator, again, like the doormen, let go. The high cost of low rent became clear. To restore services, tenants in building after building began buying them from their landlords and converting them to co-ownership. This began naturally, as you might imagine, on the Upper East Side. And indeed, by 1960, it was common to say there were hardly any good rental buildings left on the East Side. And it began to spread to the West Side. In one especially heroic move, the tenants at the Dakota made an arrangement to buy the building when the landlord announced plans to replace it with a new high-rise, since new construction was exempt from rent control. Next, please. As memories of the Depression faded, co-ownership also re-emerged as the preferred way to market new buildings. And that's both new construction of buildings like Butterfield House in the West Village, which we see here, as well as older buildings being converted not by the tenants, but by developers who came in and made upgrades and this is, of course, before tenants were allowed to stay, at least in the way they are today, during conversions. In poor areas of the city, in the 60s and 70s, what we see is abandonment. Hundreds of thousands of units were abandoned. We can think of the South Bronx, for example. But in middle-class areas of the city, equal numbers of buildings converted from rental to co-ownership. And this sort of picked up steam as we see renewed interest in middle-class city living and interest in historic preservation. Next slide, please. Since the 1980s and the dawn of the second Gilded Age, as it were, condo living has become ubiquitous in this country. For St. Louis at left to Atlanta at right, co-ownership has become, contrary to popular impressions of untrammeled sprawl, a mainstream and quintessentially American form of housing. The share of Americans living in owner-occupied single-family houses has actually been flat since 1960. And today, 1 in 5 homeowners in metropolitan America lives in a multiple rather than a single-family home. In metropolitan areas like Miami and New York, that's 1 in 3, including the suburban counties. Next, please. Unfortunately, we've not paid a lot of attention to this housing. One reason for this is they're at odds with how we understand the city, how we imagine our metropolitan areas to function. Another reason is that they're simply difficult to discern. It's impossible, I think, and Carol would probably disagree with me, and this show makes a good argument against what I'm suggesting, but I'm arguing that it's impossible to talk about a specific architecture of co-ownership, at least at a national scale. Next slide, please. That said, and by way of closing, I want to suggest that thinking about ownership, divorcing questions of form from ownership, thinking about owned multifamily housing is critically important and deserves more attention. In the Great Recession, we were obsessed with imagining the crisis as emanating from, sort of ex-urban Sun Belt single-family subdivisions, Riverside County, Central Florida, and certainly these were hugely problematic areas. But many of the greatest traumas, I contend, were experienced in particularly lower-end co-owned complexes. You can imagine in projects such as these, in a townhouse complex or a condominium apartment building, where there are collective responsibilities for basic physical maintenance, the financial misfortunes of just a handful of families who get behind on their payments can undermine the stability of an entire community. community. It's not just your one house that has weeds growing in the yard or the copper pipe stripped. It's the whole complex that goes belly up, but we simply haven't talked about these issues. Next slide, please. In cities, meanwhile, concerns about discrimination and exclusion remain. We've been all these stories recently about the Dakota, for example. While we're also facing a whole series of new questions about the growth in absentee investment ownership, which makes buildings impossible to govern. Who's going to sit on the board or go to board meetings if everybody's in Moscow? And also, of course, there are questions about whether these kinds of buildings encourage speculation, exacerbating affordability problems. I think over the next generation, as we see more singles, more retirees, more smaller households, more foreign investors, co-ownership is only going to continue to grow, become more predominant, and grow in importance. We need to wrestle with these questions, and I hope that my research on the history of co-ownerships offers us a solid foundation with which to think about some of these problems in new ways with more breadth and more depth than we have done. Thank you. I don't know how long I talked for. Hopefully it wasn't too long.
Time for questions. Any questions? So is New York exceptional then? Typical New York City exceptionalism? Could you write two histories, one that's just about New York instead of one that's...
Yes, you could write a history that's just about Manhattan, and there might be things to say about a handful of other city centers. You see some of the same things happening in Chicago or Washington, D.C. or other centers, but New York is really exceptional in terms of the volume of ownership, the amount of ownership, how sophisticated the lending community is, the development community is. Although, again, that said, if you think about, for example, the 1920s, we see more co-ownership per capita in Washington, D.C. than in New York even. And that has to do with the labor force in Washington. It's a highly white-collar labor force. Again, it's a lot of very educated people who don't have high incomes, lots of single women working as typists for the federal government, that sort of thing, who constitute a huge market for co-ownership. But New York really is special, both in terms of the market rate stuff and also in terms of the limited equity, non-market rate stuff.
Well, I was going to ask about limited equity costs, since we have the unions here. So does this happen more in New York than elsewhere?
Much more in New York. And in part it has to do with the strength of the labor movement. In part it has to do simply with the competitiveness of the housing market. There's more reason to get any edge in the market. There's more interest in multifamily living. I mean, outside of New York, you do see examples of cooperative groups coming together to develop single-family houses even. And there are union projects, there are union co-ops that are built in San Francisco. And we see other kinds of groups of left-leaning organizations getting together to build in LA, for example. But nothing on the order of what we see in New York. Part of it also comes back, at least for projects, and not all the limited equity used FHA insurance, but those which did, and that was a really important piece of the puzzle. FHA was all done out of regional offices. In New York, the regional offices were fairly sophisticated. When you go to Atlanta or Detroit or LA or any other part of the country, you have these small offices where there's tremendous pressure from Washington to just get housing built. They follow the path of least resistance in the rubber stamping single-family projects, and who wants to spend time reading the latest phone book size regulations that have come out from the cooperative housing division or the rented housing division to figure out how to do these projects. So there's resistance from FHA in a lot of places. So you see a handful of FHA co-ops, limited equity, and all the FHA projects projects were ostensibly limited equity. Now, when you have unions involved, the unions had a different set of best practices. The board wasn't typically the homeowners. There was a homeowners advisory council, but until the loans were paid off, the board was typically controlled by state officials, city officials, maybe some philanthropists, union officials. Resales were handled centrally to avoid a black market. In FHA projects, FHA had no interest in kind of policing things in that way. It didn't police these things for single-family houses, so it really let the FHA co-ops go off on their own, and almost from the start, these complexes sort of ignored limited equity rules, and people were selling their apartments for whatever they could get to whomever they liked on the open market.
Limited equity, now, just in terms of how much equity it costs to buy it, because most of the mortgages on the building. And
Right.
Co-op are also limited to the resale price.
Right. And the bylaws in the FHA buildings required this, but it was up to the board to enforce that, and they often didn't. So where we see, to get back to your original question, most of we do see FHA co-ops being built in Philadelphia and in Miami, other cities, but we don't see the kind of union co-ops like we do here.
What do you think makes for a great condo project?
Historically, or today, or in general?
Historically,
I think there are a few things. One of the critical pieces, and it's difficult to achieve this, is creating an atmosphere where people are engaged. And this doesn't have to be like in the limited equity co-ops in the 1920s, where people are operating volunteer preschools and operating cooperative groceries. But it is important, and New York is better about this than some other states, but it's important for buyers when they come into a building to understand that there is a community and that there are obligations to the community which they need to mind. One of the tricky things with co-ownership is, of course, telling a buyer that they're going to have to go to board meetings once a year, that it's not as carefree as it may seem. Is sort of a disincentive to sales. It's not the kind of thing that a developer wants to highlight. And so when we go abroad, for example, you go to China, where developers are calling all of the shots, you don't even have to have an association. There doesn't have to be a condo association at all. Lots of the developing world is like this. So the minute buildings come together, there's virtually no mechanism for maintaining the physical structure, and it all sort of starts to fall apart quickly. Even in Israel, we see this buildings falling apart. Simply because there isn't this structure. In a co-op, you don't have that problem, because even if no one ever shows up to board meetings, you still have a board that's powerful enough to look after things. Whereas a condo, you really need a robust association. So in terms of successful communities, the co-ops and condos that I've encountered in my research that were the sort of happiest places to live for the longest periods of time were places that engendered some sort of sense of community in various ways. I know that's it's hard to sort of distill that into a.
it's fine. So it's your perspective. What are some of your favorites?
In terms of complexes, some of the limit equity projects are, I think, wonderful. And again, this is a sort of perhaps obvious answer given my previous answer, but projects like Penn Station South is really an admirable complex. People there understood from the start that it was a very special project. There were lots of limited equity co-ops being built in New York, not a lot in Chelsea. Chelsea, of course, was a rundown neighborhood. It was an industrial neighborhood. It wasn't what it is today. But even at the time it opened, people were extremely proud of the complex and grateful for the participation of the federal government in terms of slum clearance, and it wasn't an uncontested clearance. There was a lot of controversy surrounding clearance of that site. But people were grateful to Moses, to the Urban Renewal program, and to the International Ladies Garment Workers Union for enabling that project. It's an interesting project too, because a lot of the people moving to that complex were coming from outer boroughs. So in effect, it was functioned as a sort of reverse white flight situation, where people are moving from the Bronx and saying, now that I live in Penn South, I can go outside at night for the first time in years. I can. That's a really kind of a magical project.
Can I want to comment? I had a student write a paper on it because her grandmother was there, and they said they closed the waiting list because it had 10,000 people on it.
The waiting list has been closed since 1987. HPD forced them to open it briefly in '96 and in 2003, but it wasn't really opened. It was opened through a lottery. There was like a brief window when you could put your name on a card, and if it were drawn out of the hat, you could then get on the waiting list. And they've voted time and again, and it's not entirely ideological. They've also voted, every time the question comes up, the city extends partial tax abatements, and the population there is so elderly, and it's always been elderly even from the start. Again, living as in Florida, they're living on fixed incomes. So if they were to face their full market rate tax burden, maintenance prices would go up by 50%, which is more than... What?
The vote was whether to go to market, right? You didn't say the vote was about...
Oh, sorry, yes, the vote was whether to, go to market. And they've...
Grand Street had done, right?
Which all the ones on Grand Street have done this. Virtually all of them have done this as it's come up. A few, I showed a slide, Queensview, it was some towers in Astoria. Queensview remains limited equity, but the sister project, Queensview West, across the street, went market rate. Some of these places which have gone market rate, if you're in Bayside, Queens, there isn't actually a whole lot of price difference between limited equity and market rate, but certainly in Manhattan.
How would you rate Battery Park City in this?
Oh, that's an interesting question. And I have to confess, I don't know a whole lot about Battery Park City in this regard, because there are quite a number of rental buildings here.
Yeah, condos come late in its evolution.
And a lot of that has to do, and I forget that my all that I once knew about Battery Park City. But there was sort of specific programs that were set up to encourage rental housing, no? HUD, but presumably, and again, I don't know what the Battery Park City Authority's position is, but one can imagine at some point all of the housing here converting to owner occupied, and this is what we see sort of time and again with new construction and middle class construction. After World War II is when we do see new rental buildings built. They very quickly tend to convert once the kind of after a few years of depreciation and once the best tax benefits have been taken. And in part of it is about taxes. Part of it is also about that once buildings leave rent regulation, no one wants to pay market rents. Many people would rather own, even if it means having to come up with a lot of cash at the time a building converts. Lots of landlords, especially in an inflationary climate like the 70s and early 80s, people are predicting that rental housing is over, period, except for in public housing, because costs are going up so quickly. Landlords just don't want to have to ask their tenants for 25% rent increases every year, and everyone decides it's better to just go to ownership rather than rental. That's not a very good answer to your question, but... Yes.
That sort of actually plays exactly into what my question was, which is that what you see happening in New York right now? Are rentals going away? I mean, it seems like every new piece of new construction is a condo. I think, my uncle's a landlord himself, and he was just talking about, I could make more money by converting my buildings to condos. And I mean, what does that mean for the future of the rental market in New York as the population grows?
That is a good question. I mean, certainly over time, we've seen a greater share of apartments being in ownership, and the rental market is extremely complicated in New York, precisely because of rent regulations and the history of rent regulation and the threat of rent regulation. What we've seen in historically is that production of rentals comes in fits and starts. So in the 70s, in this period of inflation, when tons of buildings are converting and every new building is owner occupied, it does seem for many years like rental housing is history, and then once the sort of market for ownership collapses or at least relaxes a little bit, rental investment becomes lucrative again, and we see a switch. Over the last several years during the Great Recession, the only bright spot in housing nationally was in rental housing, and a lot of it has been attributed to Gen Y preferences and this and that, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that there was very little interest in ownership. New York is a little bit special again in this respect, but certainly outside of New York, co-ownership tends to fall somewhere in terms of who gravitates to it between the rental and between the single-family house. And we see this in terms of duration of tenure. So if the average rental tenant, and again outside of New York where we have tenant-directed rent laws, average in an owner-occupied single-family house, it may be 10 or 11 years. In a co-owned apartment or townhouse, it might be 4 years, 5 years, 6 years. So when prices start to flatten, condo buyers understand that they're going to get caught in this window, and the market just evaporates for owner-occupied housing. So we see a shift back to rentals, but now that prices are starting to appreciate again, not only is the market for owner-occupied coming back, but many of the rentals built over the last 5 or 6 years are going to convert, and your uncle will be converting some of his buildings, and it sort of comes and goes. Now, the other interesting thing that I didn't talk about at all, I sort of alluded to it briefly at the end, is the shadow rental market. And that is that many condos, many co-owned units end up effectively becoming rented housing, an unregulated form of rental housing, and a very sort of ad hoc form of rental housing. And many argue that it kind of destabilizes morale in buildings. So the way to a good, happy condo is to have very tight restrictions on the number of rental tenants. And it depends. Some cities have very strict stipulations in terms of what bylaws require. There are many suburban upper crust suburban counties will limit number of renters to 10% in condo projects because they don't want. There's sort of all these racialized fears about who renters may be. But across the board, sort of 25 to 35% of co-owned units end up back in the rental market. So there is a bit of recycling there. But in terms of who wants to build new rental housing, certainly in New York since the 1940s, I'm sure there are people who, off the top of my head, and I may be totally wrong, I'm going to guess that the majority, and perhaps the overwhelming majority of sort of permanent rental housing has been done in conjunction with some sort of public inducement. But in terms of what ordinary private developers are putting up at market rates, there's why get involved with rentals unless you have a specific plan to convert shortly.
So this seems like a good opportunity, since we have many more questions, to also have a drink before we leave, ask questions individually, and also buy a book if you'd like one. So, so let's thank Matt, and I'll run over and I'll pour some wine, and we can.
Thank you everyone for your questions, and I'm happy to try and answer more.